You would scarcely believe it, but the ruling classes of the West are still mourning the deceased Saudi monarch, King Abdullah. For example, it was recently revealed in The Guardian that the UK taxpayer spent more than £100,000 sending David Cameron to Saudi Arabia to perform such mourning rituals. But Saudi Arabia is actually in the news now for less salubrious reasons. For while politicians bow and scrape and offer their condolences to the Saudi royals, the human rights charity Reprieve reports that the regime is preparing to behead and crucify Mohammed al-Nimr, who was arrested as a teenager for his participation in pro-democracy protests in 2012. The issue first gained international attention when British opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn named the teen in a speech reported in this BBC article, urging David Cameron to intervene to stop the killing. Prince Mohammed of Saudi Arabia issued a statement in response to Corbyn's speech, reported on the BBC, claiming that the lack of respect for Saudi Arabia would damage diplomatic relations. This must have been calculated to give Corbyn sleepless nights. Subsequently, Mohammed al-Nimr's mother made a public appeal to President Obama to intervene. As The Guardian reports, the mother described the intended punishment as savage and backwards in the extreme. As of recording, the execution is still scheduled to go ahead. What one wouldn't know from most of the coverage, because most of the media is too polite to mention it, is that such appeals for intervention are in fact quite embarrassing for both Cameron and Obama. Jon Snow of Channel 4 News, to his credit, raised this embarrassing fact when he interviewed Cameron in early October. He pointed out that the UK had only recently made a deal with Saudi Arabia to ensure it was admitted to the UN Human Rights Council, an appointment that, as reported at The Intercept, was welcomed by the US State Department. Cameron's argument, when challenged about this, was to claim that Saudi Arabia provided important intelligence and security information that keeps us safe. Why do the US and UK insist on maintaining such close relations with what is arguably the region's worst human rights abuser and main exporter of religious sectarianism in the form of Wahhabi Islam, the doctrine espoused by both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State? The Economist, Britain's major business magazine, offers its own synopsis. Their close alliance dates to the end of the Second World War, when an ailing Franklin Roosevelt met Saudi Arabia's founding king, Abdulaziz, aboard the cruiser Quincy in the Suez Canal. Then, and for decades after, the equation was simple. America would provide security, the Saudis oil. The Economist represents the alliance as a simple coalition of interest, consolidated by the Cold War and increasingly endangered since the collapse of communism. In fact, this is a whitewashing. As Robert Vitalis has shown in his book, America's Kingdom, the relationship was indeed pivoted on oil, but it began in 1933 with the first concessions made by the new regime, itself formed through an alliance of the Wahhabi leaders with British colonialism, to Standard Oil of California and later to Texaco. And this was to be the beginning of the Arabian American Oil Company. Vitalis demonstrates that US energy capitalists were central to the development of the nation's economic structure, often on the basis of a racist Jim Crow system, just as British and American military and political power protected the regime. The Saudi state, flush with oil capital, would prove integral to the British strategy of maintaining a regional network of clients and building up national security apparatuses to keep restless populations in line. In the same way, it became integral to the US regional strategy after Britain withdrew from its east of Suez imperial commitments. Today, it is not just energy capitalists who are heavily invested in the future of the Saudi regime. Saudi Arabia is one of the major international purchasers of international arms. As a result, as The Intercept reports, arms manufacturers Lockheed Martin and Boeing are among the foremost ideological defenders of the regime. And it now seems that after years of maintaining a limited army and operating through proxies from Afghanistan to Syria, Saudi Arabia is finding ways to make use of the enormous stockpiles of weaponry at its disposal by waging war on Yemen. Earlier this year, after a prolonged challenge to the Yemeni government by assorted opposition forces, including the Shia Houthis from the country's north, Saudi Arabia decided to launch a series of brutal bombing raids to crush the opposition. The Saudi-owned newspaper Al Arabiya had no doubt about the validity of the state's actions. Saudi decisive storm waged to save Yemen, it trumpeted. Saudi Arabia waged early Thursday Operation Decisive Storm against the Houthi coup in Yemen and in support of legitimate President Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi. Such explicit propaganda is not the rule in most of the Anglophone media. Rather, they prefer to muddy the waters on the nature of the conflict. A fairly typical BBC piece on this campaign represents the struggle as a chaotic faction fight, as the country has descended into conflicts between rival groups in which may thrive terrorist security threats to the United Kingdom. But perhaps more insidiously, all of these news stories leave out the crucial fact that Western governments are backing Saudi Arabia's war. As fairness and accuracy in reporting points out, even as the New York Times and the Washington Post report on the carnage inflicted by Saudi bombing, they omit entirely the information that made this news particularly relevant to the paper's mostly American readership. The US government is actively backing the war in Yemen that killed those civilians. The Saudi military intervention follows years of US bombings, often conducted by drone, in defense of the regime. Thank God for the Saudis and Prince Bandar, the right-wing Senator John McCain told CNN recently. The proximate cause of McCain's applause was that, as he saw it, the Saudi government was an ally of the democratic opposition to Assad in Syria. This grovelling support for Saudi Arabia is, as Li Fang writes at The Intercept, a commonplace on the American right. Of course, Saudi Arabia has never seen a democratic movement it didn't want to squash. So what is Saudi Arabia actually doing in Syria? Going by past form, one would expect it to support the overthrow of a Shia government linked to Iran, and also to back the most reactionary, violent religious currents in the opposition. And that, though it is not widely reported in the media, appears to be what is happening, with Saudi funds disappearing into the coffers of Jabhat al-Nusra, an offshoot of al-Qaeda, which, as Kim Sangupta reports in The Independent, has been a target of US bombing in Syria. In this connection, Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept spotted a particularly telling example of uncritical pro-Saudi propaganda at the BBC. In an article, the original version of which is now only available as a cached website, the BBC had quoted an unnamed Saudi source as the source for all of its reporting. And one major aspect of its article included the claim that the government wasn't funding any jihadi groups in Syria. And when the blatant falsehood of this claim was pointed out, the updated version of the article simply edited out the quote rather than challenging the Saudi claim. As Greenwald pointed out, the anonymous official's claims had been mindlessly and uncritically presented as fact. He added, "It is the rare exception when the BBC reports adversarially on the Saudis." There have also been claims that Saudi Arabia has condoned funding for ISIS. As Business Insider reports, Saudi citizens continue to represent a significant funding source for Sunni groups operating in Syria. The jihadis of the Islamic State would relish the opportunity to take the regime down. But in a speech last year, the former head of British intelligence, Sir Richard Dearlove, claimed that the regime was tacitly in favour of the movement's attacks on Shia Muslims. Maybe a blind eye was turned, he said, to funding that had been channeled to the Islamic State. This would be a particularly dangerous move for the Saudi government to take. Mohammed Bazi writes for The New Yorker that ISIS has declared war against the Saudi kingdom, calling for Muslims to rise up against Saudi Arabia's ruling family. ISIS claims that the regime is a decadent usurper which doesn't uphold the values that it claims to defend. A case which is made easier when, as The Guardian reports, a leading Saudi prince is arrested in Lebanon on suspicion of running drugs. Yet it would not be the first time that the Saudi regime had helped to arm religious reactionaries for as long as their violence was directed against opponents, and there is a strong overlap between the official Wahhabi orthodoxy of the Saudi state and that of the ISIS leadership. This is not to say that one can reduce all of the region's problems to the influence of Saudi religious doctrine. As Karen Armstrong writes for The New Statesman, while Wahhabism has been an ideological pillar of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, in both cases, recruits are often secular or religious novices, either non-observant or self-taught. Their motives are political rather than religious. Yet while Saudi Arabia lashes out in regional warfare and domestic repression, there is evidence that it is on the brink of a serious crisis. The IMF reports that its cash reserves are in freefall, due in large part to the fall in oil prices, according to The Independent. Since Saudi Arabia generates 90% of its income from oil, the slump in global energy prices represents a potential crisis for the regime, both economic and political. Such a regime, arguably the closest ally of the US and UK in the region, aside from Israel, is ripe for a political implosion in which the most plausible agents of its overthrow could very well be any of the armed reactionaries now being cheerfully funded by either the Saudi government or by Saudi citizens.